When Ralph Stogdill, my professor, the world-famous authority on leadership, ended his career, he ended it by publishing his final work called The Handbook of Leadership. In that book, he summarized 40 years of research into management. And on page 419, right at the very end of the book, he says that structuring expectations is the single pattern of management behavior that contributes positively to productivity, to job satisfaction, to accomplishing organizational goals. So perhaps there's nothing more important for you and I to talk about than the role of structuring expectations. When I talk about structuring expectations, I'm talking about a participative concept where you and your people together fashion goals, objectives, and standards. Sometimes the goals, or the things you want to accomplish, are not negotiable. For example, let's assume that you're responsible for moving a group of people from San Francisco all the way to Boston. Now, it does you very little good as a manager to tell the people who perhaps are flying for you to shut up and fly to Boston. Remember, they're not going to vote that they'd rather go to Chicago. The goal is Boston. But typically what most managers do is they end up in Boston waiting for the troops to arrive, and when they don't get there, they slap their hands and say, "Gotcha! You didn't do what I told you to do." Now, instead of managing change and managing people towards objectives that way, let's back up and start again at the very beginning. Let's agree participatively with our own folks that even though they may not be voting on Boston, there's a lot of discussion and negotiation that can go on. For example, you may agree that the best route to go takes you over Denver, takes you over to Chicago, and down into Boston. The object is to manage them from point to point to point, rather than punishing them if they don't get there on time. So what you want to do is agree up front on where you're going to go, how you're going to do it, who's going to do what. And when they arrive over Denver, they can then get back to you and say, here's where we are, here's how well we're doing. At that point, you want to manage them all the way to Chicago. Once you get them to Chicago, you want to manage them all the way to Boston. And remember, at each point along the way, conditions change. You may have to constantly renegotiate with your own people, not where you're going, that's a given, but kind of how you're going to get there and how well you're doing along the way. Now, there's a very simple technique called an arrow diagram that we're going to talk about in this unit that more or less outlines this. And what we're going to suggest to you is that once you decide where you've got to go, you start off with that point in mind before they ever leave the ground. And you back up and assign responsibilities to individuals as to who's going to do what. Who's responsible for the weather, who's responsible for the fuel, who's responsible for checking this or that, so that everybody knows not only where they're going, how they're going to get there, but who's going to do what along the way. That's a participative process of moving people towards accomplishing organizational goals. It sounds so simple, but it's so rarely done. For example, I wonder how many of you out there have a PhD. One of the nice things about this example is that academics manage so badly. For example, to get a PhD, what one has to do is to go 4 years to undergraduate school. That's kind of like flying from San Francisco to Denver. And then after 4 years of undergraduate school, you get a master's degree, and that's kind of like flying from Denver to Chicago. And then you usually go 2 to 3 years of more training for your doctorate, and that's kind of like trying to go from Chicago to Boston, except over half of the PhD candidates in the United States crash a couple of 100 miles from Boston. Now that sounds very familiar because I see organizations all the time where people are managed from point to point to point, where compensation and reward systems are focused on Denver and Chicago. And what happens is if people think they're going to be promoted or rewarded by hitting these micro targets, they'll hit them. They'll get to Denver right on time. They'll get to Chicago right on time. Now they may crash the way doctoral students do 300 miles from Boston, but that's next quarter. So instead, if you back up and start the whole process, you begin to appreciate where doctoral students break down, where managers break down, where our employees break down is right here at the very end, in finally reaching the objective. What stops doctoral students is, at the end of this process of being a doctoral candidate, you take a series of examinations called comprehensives, and then finally, you write your dissertation, your original contribution to knowledge. You're 1 year away from reaching Boston, and half the troops fail. They fail because they aren't managed that last little bit towards final implementation. What happens to a lot of doctoral students, what happens to a lot of people at work, is that you go before your boss for the final last thing that you've got to do, namely your original contribution to knowledge. The professor has a bit of research that he wants you to do. It's a bit for him or for her, but it's a year and a half for you. You go off to the jungles or the factories or wherever you're gathering data and doing your research and come back a year and a half or 2 years later with 200 pages of computer printout, 150 pages of text, confident that your professor will reward you by making you a PhD. To your horror, what you find is that your professor, the world's famous authority on this particular theory that you've been researching, is dead. Or worse, has moved to another university. And in her place stands another professor with a different theoretical persuasion who says, "You call this a dissertation? Do it again." That happens to doctoral students, it happens to employees, it happens and has happened to probably everyone watching this tape because there's no final link. Back up from the very beginning, for example, as I do with my students. I have a bunch of graduate students that I see every year, and I always ask, how many of you would like to take this graduate course, required course, with no papers, no feedback, no written analysis of cases, just one big fat final at the end? Pass the final, and you pass the required course. Flunk the final, and you can kiss your MBA goodbye. No one has ever voted for a one big fat final. So instead, we all agree that perhaps it's best to back up to the very beginning and agree that we're going to have papers and quizzes and midterms and finals so that by the time my students arrive at the final examination, they know their final exam, plus or minus, or final grade, plus or minus 15 or 20%. See, I feel that with my students, my job is not to play I've got a secret, and their job is to guess it on the final. I feel the same way about the people who work for me in my company. It does me very little good, as I said before, to play I've got a secret and punish them when they don't accomplish organizational objectives, because it hurts all of us when that happens. Once you agree on goals, and once you agree on objectives, and once you sort out, as you'll see when we practice arrow diagramming, how to assign responsibilities to people, your job is not over. Now you have to make sure that they're doing it, and they're doing it at a level of performance by standards that are agreed upon and acceptable to both parties. After you have expectations, working your way back through standards, you still have to start with tasks. What do you have to do to accomplish those expectations? Those tasks have to be broken down into bite-sized, measurable, tangible pieces. And then you can attach standards to each piece. How do you know you're doing a good job as you do each piece? That's a critical question. You need to know that, not so you can tell your employee how well he or she is doing, rather so that they can keep their own score, so that they know how well they're doing every day when they come to work, whether you're there to tell them or not. When you establish standards for people, make sure that those standards are measurable, specific, time-bounded, and realistic. They'll be realistic if they're developed in concert with the people who work for you. You know, very often we get so hung up on targets and objectives, we forget that a good part of management is moving people along the path and making sure that they're maintaining standards. We've already seen that there are some times where objectives are locked in cement and aren't negotiable. Sometimes, however, objectives can become barriers, can get in the way. You know, I find I can walk in the door in my company any particular morning and the phones are ringing, the telexes are telexing, the PCs are PCing, the conference room is used, and I don't know what's going on. The people answering those phones and running the PCs are much more knowledgeable about what they do than I know about what they do. I find that my role as boss is often just keeper of standards. I'm guiding forces, moving us in a direction that I want us to go, but trying to make sure that as we go, we are maintaining the very best potential, the very best quality that my company is capable of. One company president runs a string of department stores in the Midwest. We had trained over 300 managers in participative management. He wanted to do an experiment to see if this stuff would really work in his department stores. So after the training, he picked one department store for the experiment. The department store had never done more than $170,000 worth of business on a particular day of the calendar. When that day rolled up again, he decided to bring all the employees together, all the managers who've been trained in participative management, to work on a target. Let's see if we can hit $300,000, he said. Well, why $300,000? He thought that was a figure that would stretch them. They'd have to reach to achieve it, even though they had never come close to that. But the employees came together, the managers came together, and they worked out a scheme, a plan. During the day, as the employees were selling product as fast and best as they could, the public address system would make announcements. If they hit $100,000, the first announcement would be, Mr. Green, please call 999. And then if they hit $200,000, Mr. Blue, please call 999. And then, if by chance they ever got to $300,000, the address system would say, Mr. Gold, call 999. Well, during the day, they heard Mr. Blue and they heard Mr. Green, and finally, probably to everybody's surprise, they heard Mr. Gold, please call 999. At that point, everything stopped. The employees cheered, they hugged customers, they shook hands, they had a little party, and they still had 3 hours worth of business to go, from 6 to 9, which is usually the most profitable and productive part of the business day. But from 6 to 9, all business stopped. You see, the employees had hit their target, a target that management never thought they would achieve, and by putting it there, instead of stretching them, it now became a barrier. It got in the way. The job of management is to move people along the path, to push them, but to be flexible, to negotiate. Let's take a look at one manager who pushes an employee, who pushes a subordinate, but is responsive and helps guide him along the path to increasing that person's productivity.
Pete, this schedule is crazy. We'll never be able to get it done by June 1st.
I know, it sounds crazy to me, too. I've been sitting here trying to figure out how to make it happen.
We don't have the bodies. I mean, we're already into overtime. And this type of analysis needs time.
Look, I know it's tough, but it's time for all hands on deck. We've got to make it happen. In the ideal world, what would we have to throw at this to hit a June 1st completion?
Well, in the ideal world, if I could get everything I needed, I would start with more people.
How many?
Probably 3 total.
How many do you have now?
Well, 3, but Mary's committed to Charlie's project, and lately Bill has been out with a back problem. There's absolutely no...
Are you telling me that if we could get 2 more folks, that this target is possible?
Not just 2 more folks, these 2 folks. They're the best people we have.
Have you checked to see if we could get Mary back?
Are you kidding? Charlie would never let her go now.
How would it be if I did battle with Charlie? I mean, that's a lot easier than fixing Bill's back. Could we replace Bill?
Actually, he could probably do a lot of this stuff at home. If we could set him up with a modem, we could print out his input from here.
Is that a big deal?
Not really. No, we could requisition the equipment. We could have the thing up and running in 24 hours.
That manager was earning his money. He's doing what he's paid to do, which is to make his own employees more productive, to help guide them, to work with them in accomplishing organizational objectives. You know, when you act like that, when you get in there with the troops and really help them perform, what are you really doing? Aren't you just acting like the best boss you ever had? And best bosses pop up everywhere, in hospitals and banks and department stores, because they all tend to do the same thing. Whether they smile or not, their role is to identify and remove obstacles. Let's take some time now, give you a chance to practice acting like the best boss you ever had.